Hi, I'm Roger Chilton, the oldest hippie in Dixon, and also the first. And having lived at New Buffalo, the commune that everybody knows about before that. Anyway, about 1972, me and John Carlisle made a trip to Espanola, a typical trip we do every couple of weeks to buy dog food and some beer and whatever. And then back in those days, not everybody had his own vehicle, and we shared vehicles and we went to town jointly and so forth. And in this case, I was driving the state vehicle, the 1949 Chevrolet, which was ubiquitous. They were all over the place. Chevrolet pickup truck, half-ton. And we had been in Espanola. It was a nice afternoon in summer. And we had our bags and our groceries and our couple of six-packs of beer. And I want to mention that back in the old hippie days, this is worth pointing out, hippies hardly drank at all. It was mostly psychedelics, as everyone probably knows, and almost looked down upon people who drank. But I was with John Carlisle, and he was one of the first alcoholics I'd ever hung out with and realized that he was an alcoholic. And anyway, we were driving out of Espanola, speaking of alcoholics, and as we're leaving, I started to say we were approaching the last light, but in those days there was only one light in Espanola, and we were on the edge of town heading up for Dixon again. And there was a man hitchhiking by the side of the road, and I somehow was able to recognize this man as a Taos Indian, because I had lived in New Buffalo near Taos, and we'd associated with the Indians there quite a bit. And he didn't have a blanket, but he just somehow struck me as a Taos Indian. I put on the brakes, I stopped. He got in the vehicle between John and I, and we immediately realized he was pretty drunk. And the fact was that he had been on a program where part of the rehabilitation of alcoholics was to teach them some trade out El Rito. There was a school there, and they drove him there in a school bus from Taos Pueblo along with many other people. And on the way back, coming through Espanola, he jumped bus and went out and got himself drunk and had no ride home. So we picked him up, and we're driving up the highway toward Dixon. We started drinking. He happened to have a little bottle, a half pint, I believe it was, of blueberry brandy or blackberry brandy. It was kind of a conventional little drink that people would chase down real quick. I don't know why. And we drank that, and then we stopped the vehicle and got our beers out of the back. And pretty soon we were all drunk driving up the road. And I want to mention that driving drunk, I still believe, is one of the great pleasures of life, but you don't want to overdo it, of course. But we were having a very nice time, partying, you might say, driving along. And when we got to the Dixon turnoff, we just looked at each other and said, what the hell, let's take this guy all the way into the Taos Pueblo. So we drove the next 25 miles up to Taos, sobering up slightly on the way. And we arrived at the Taos Pueblo, where I had been a number of times before, having lived at New Buffalo, etc., and having advice from the Indians. We knew them pretty well. But it was the first time I'd ever been there at night. And it was very dark, and I don't remember if they had gotten their electricity there at that time yet or not. This Indian fellow invited us up to his apartment. He almost insisted that we come up. So we went up one or two flights of stairs in the dark. We got to his place, and John and I were worried that the man's wife would berate us and blame us for getting him off the wagon, and we didn't know what to expect, but he was insisting, and so we went in. And it turned out to be exactly the opposite of what we had expected. They were extremely welcoming, sincere, hospitable. We had a little bit to eat. There was his wife and two older teenage daughters, it seemed like. And we had a very nice little conversation for half an hour or so, and they made no accusations, and they were absolutely thrilled that we had brought him home. And when we were about to leave, the man went into another dark room. The place was lit with a kerosene lamp, very little furniture, all adobe colored, bancos, etc., to sit on. And he came out from the other room with a little black pot in his hand, which at the time I didn't recognize was a seed pot, and also a big ear of blue dried corn. And he handed it to me as a gift, and instructed me to plant one seed per hole, one in a hole. Well, I'd grown corn for the last year or two, and I'd always followed my wife's axiom, which is 4 seeds per hole, 1 for the worm, 1 for the crow, 1 to thin, and 1 to grow. But I took this ear of corn home and planted it. The seed pot, incidentally, I'd like to mention, although it has little to do with the story, eventually became the property of Jane Kaluta, who many of you will recognize as the founder of the library that we are now sitting in. She's now deceased, but I don't know what became of the pot. But I took the seeds and planted them in the ground, and sure enough, as the man said, it was about 100% germination. I proceeded to grow that same strain of blue corn for about 10 years, and it started to lose its identity and became kind of coppery colored, very beautiful, but I somehow didn't want copper colored corn, and I stopped growing it. And later I got a couple more ears from a couple of fellows who grew it ritually, not so much for a crop, but just to keep it going, some corn that they had gotten from some Hopis. And they gave me 2 ears of that. And I've been growing that for about 20 years, and I'm still growing it. It's maintained its identity. And I eat it for breakfast in a form of atole, which is like hippie-style atole. Instead of milk and sugar, it's savory with chili, corn, and beans. And tamari and gamazio with it too, and I love it, and I must have had it, I've tried to do the math on it, probably about 6,000 times for breakfast now, since I do it about at least 300 a year. But anyway, I don't sell it. I sometimes give it to friends, but I just grow it sort of as a hobby and as a mainstay. Just a week or so ago, a Taos Indian asked me if I had any blue corn. She knew that I grew it. I was a friend of hers. And she was having a peyote meeting for her brother who had recently gotten out of the hospital. And as many of you know, when the meeting ends at dawn, people step out of the teepee, and the women have usually prepared a little dish of 3 different materials, 1 fruit and 1 meat, and 1 of roasted ground blue corn, which you just take a pinch of. This is only a symbolic meal. The real meal follows later. And so I gave that quart of the blue corn to Rose to have at a peyote meeting at the Taos Pueblo, and I guess that just about wraps up my story, beginning and ending at the Taos Pueblo.